Hey folks, today I'll be talking about StarCraft II through the lens of an Age of Empires player, through the lens of someone deeply familiar with the RTS genre, but relatively new to the world of StarCraft. If you missed Part 1, I highly recommend that you watch it prior to watching this video. Part 1 focused on high-level concepts like design philosophy. In this second part, I'd like to segue into some nuts and bolts game mechanics. Understanding how armies fight each other in StarCraft II requires a significant paradigm shift from Age of Empires. Due to a slower game speed, weaker AI, more melee units, and simpler macro mechanics, micromanagement was incredibly important in Age of Empires. After Age of Empires 2, it wasn't uncommon to be manually controlling dozens of units on the battlefield. Even straightforward interactions, like pikemen beating cavalry, required attention. Pikemen are intended to win this fight easily, as demonstrated here. But when the cavalry player micros, he can easily win. Effective army control in StarCraft II involves lots of manual micro, of course, but one of the most fundamental skills players learn as they get better is how to make their units do the correct thing on their own, pre-splitting, leveraging concave formations, and including lots of splash damage units to take advantage of natural clumping in fights. Moving up the tech tree in StarCraft II usually means getting access to units that do splash damage rather than better versions of your existing units. Age of Empires frequently took the opposite approach. The designers preferred to give players small numbers of powerful units and sturdier versions of their existing ones. I can still remember the momentum shift in Age of Empires 2 when a player would bring knights out onto the field, or jarls in Age of Mythology. Both were strong, sturdy units that could tank a lot of damage and kill lots of units by themselves due to their excellent stats. By comparison, tanks, High Templar, Ravagers, Infestors, and Colossus are all examples of units that are effective not just because of their stats, but because of their ability to do splash damage and massacre uncontrolled enemy armies. These units are actually less sturdy than their lower tech counterparts. They make up for it in DPS. The designers took into account the fact that units clump naturally, and preventing this in a very large army is difficult. When this element is removed, for instance by an AI that can control every unit at once, these high-tech units are rendered worthless. Zerglings and Marines suddenly trade cost-effectively against everything. Humans can only do that in very specific situations and can't rely on it as a general strategy. This is a fascinating design approach and another example of balance through a high skill ceiling. Better control of lower tech units enables interactions that aren't possible normally. In Age of Mythology, it didn't matter very much how well you microed against a Jarl. It was a really good unit, and if you didn't tech up yourself, you would probably just die. This highlights another important point. High-tech units in Age of Empires were an order of magnitude better than lower-tech units. At first glance, this makes sense. A player invested in tech and is rewarded by better units. In theory, players need to balance this investment against vulnerability to a fast, low-tech attack. What happens in practice is that Natural Defender's advantage makes teching up hard to punish, ensuring that it becomes a dominant strategy. Fast advancements to the Third Age were frequently a staple of the competitive meta thanks to this design approach. The balance tilted toward the player teching up faster, and usually only favored the player building lower-tech units when there was a strongly imbalanced unit available, such as Set's Animals or the Abyss gun. StarCraft II adopts a number of different design approaches that prevent this, each of which is fascinating. One I've already mentioned. Low-tech units are strong when controlled well, especially against small numbers of high-tech units. Another is the way workers are incorporated into Defender's advantage. Age of Empires allowed the town center to fight enemy units if workers were garrisoned, simultaneously adding to the player's defenses and protecting their economy. StarCraft II instead forces a trade-off. Workers are individually stronger than in Age of Empires, but cannot be garrisoned and need to be pulled in order to contribute to the defense. This allows the attacker to do economic damage even if their attack is repelled. Speaking of teching up, it's worth emphasizing that many high-tech units in Age of Empires were melee units. The Age series emphasized mixed melee and ranged compositions, almost certainly because this reflects the battle tactics used in the Middle Ages. This has a critical impact on how games flow. Melee units have a comparatively harder time finding damage because it's difficult to use positioning to gain an advantage. One way or another, the unit needs to be adjacent to the opposing army in order to engage with it. Ranged units can stand at the periphery and pick off units one by one, allowing players with good control to trade efficiently and prevent small disadvantages from snowballing. All this put together just really means that it's easier for a designer to make a ranged unit work as compared to a melee unit. There's much more room for error because the designer can always fall back on the strength of player control. Aside from the Hellbat, it's worth noting that no additional melee units were added in either the Heart of the Swarm or Legacy of the Void expansion packs, probably because it would be too difficult to implement and balance them correctly. By comparison, the Norse civilization in Age of Mythology was always poorly calibrated due to its heavy reliance on mostly melee compositions. Either the race was too strong or too weak, with Loki in particular landing on the extreme of both sides of the spectrum during the development of the metagame. While we're on the topic of unit design, I wanted to quickly mention that the tech and unit trees in each Age of Empires game were vastly more complex than the tech tree in StarCraft II. I've provided some images on screen to demonstrate. Yet again, we see the Age series favor breadth, while StarCraft II favors depth. An important difference in the way armies were controlled in Age is what I would call their unmanaged effectiveness, their ability to do the right thing without micromanagement. Under this umbrella, I'll include several design features. Attack move, which was either not present or not properly functional until an early patch in Age of Empires 3, unit AI and pathing, which was much worse in the Age games, and unlimited unit selection, which was both not available in Age and also worked differently than in StarCraft II. Putting all these together, armies in Age were remarkably ineffective when left to their own devices, with a big impact on the flow of games. One is the value of player control. Dumb units on move command require careful attention and management, and very easily act in non-optimal ways. This means engagements are often more about control than anything else, meaning a higher percentage of engagements can be viably taken. Attack move, strong AI, strong pathing, and unlimited unit selection nullify this. It's much easier to get units to do the right thing, so players prefer to retreat from theoretically unfavorable engagements rather than try to control their way to victory. This is compounded by StarCraft II's counter system, which is relatively much harder than the soft counters present in the Age series. The result is fewer meaningful engagements in the average StarCraft II game, and a lot more baiting, poking, and repositioning than in Age. Another impact is the pace of battles. Dumb units on move command spend a lot of time doing nothing, making battles longer and again rewarding the player with the best control. Battles in Age felt a lot less sudden than they do in StarCraft II, and I think this is only partly the result of the slower game clock. Units simply needed more hand-holding and weren't as proficient at automatically engaging in the fight. Maybe this is just me, but a more subtle effect of smarter units is a relative decrease in the sense of player agency in their armies. Playing StarCraft II can sometimes feel like positioning pieces on a chessboard rather than actively controlling an army. The frequency with which the right approach to an engagement is simply to let your units do the right thing while looking away to do something else makes me feel somewhat detached from my own units. Again, I'll emphasize that this agency point is more my personal opinion rather than a neutral discussion of the design and its effects. StarCraft II has also evolved the concept of micromanagement through heavy reliance on the ability mechanic, like Psystorm or Siege and Unsiege. Traditional micro focused on clean and efficient execution of basic unit behavior, like moving and attacking. StarCraft II smooths out these basic tasks with smarter AI and pathing, but adds steeper ability requirements to compensate. Dustin Browder, in a 2008 interview, commented that StarCraft II actually requires more micromanagement than its predecessor. Personally, I prefer to think that the micromanagement is simply different. I think Blizzard felt uncomfortable imposing micromanagement requirements that felt antiquated or annoying. Dustin himself alludes to this when discussing the design of Vespene geysers. In order to keep the skill ceiling high, Blizzard simply shifted micromanagement focus onto abilities. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong about either approach. It depends on the type of game the designer wants to build. Switching gears a bit, the resources available to players are also very different between the two series. Age of Empires historically had 3 resources, food, wood, and gold, plus a 4th that differed across games. Stone in the first 2, favor in Age of Mythology, and experience in Age of Empires 3. At first glance, StarCraft only has 2, minerals and Vespene gas. However, if we look more closely, we can also see 2 additional resources, time and attention. Time is the cost of producing a unit or building. Aside from some minor considerations like chrono boost, time to do things is fixed. This is a huge difference in design from Age of Empires, where multiple units could be assigned to build a single structure, greatly decreasing its construction time. One of the biggest paradigm shifts I needed to make as I started playing StarCraft II was the cost and time of losing units or buildings. It took me a long time to understand that a cancel on a third base was a big deal. Even though the player gets back some minerals, they don't get back the time. Unlike Age of Empires, they can't use additional workers to speed up construction time and make up for it. It can seem trivial until you properly adjust your perspective, but the difference between a 5-minute and 7-minute third base is significant. At first glance, choosing between first building a third base against first building additional production as Terran seems like a pretty even trade. The former produces a bigger economy in the long run, whereas the latter results in a bigger army in the short term. What's difficult to appreciate, at least for me, is how impactful an additional base is on your economy. The window of time where choosing more production results in a larger army is vanishingly small. Part of my problem is that I only started playing competitively in Age of Mythology, where taking additional bases was mostly to secure more supply. Age of Empires III brought back freely droppable town centers, but most competitive games were one-base affairs. You have to go back all the way to Age of Empires II to find an Age game where expanding and building additional town centers was as critical as it is in Legacy of the Void. I think time is arguably the most misunderstood resource in StarCraft II. I think one of the most confusing experiences in StarCraft II is building the appropriate counter to an opponent's army, but losing because they simply had more stuff. At a small scale, the small time gaps that leave production buildings idle add up over the course of even a medium-length game. At a larger scale, strategic mistakes like sacrificing good macro fundamentals to focus on army control can result in a loss even when an attack is seemingly successful. Early on, I struggled with this. I often delayed expanding in order to play aggressively on 2 bases. A common frustration for me was the feeling that I could never keep up with Protoss. If my attacks didn't outright kill them, they were always substantially ahead. As I started to play more macro-focused games, I realized that I could keep up with the Protoss if I simply macroed as well as he did. In fact, I could get better tech if I macroed better than he did. It was a revelation to me that there is actually a point in the game where Protoss doesn't have Storm. And wouldn't you know, by the time they get Storm, you've teched up to units that can actually counter it. Amazing. All jokes aside, my core misunderstanding here was regarding time. The Protoss, having survived my attacks, had already built an additional base and gotten some of their tech going. Even if their economy was damaged, they were vastly ahead in terms of time, an advantage that would snowball due to additional worker production and less oversaturation. One of the biggest trade-offs that you make when playing an aggressive style and delaying your macro is the loss of time. If the attacks are defended, you are so far behind your opponent in either tech or bases that you simply don't have the time to catch up before your disadvantage snowballs into a loss. This also highlights one of the core secondary features of StarCraft II, which is its streaming and educational community. Strategy guides and the like existed back in Age of Empires, but there's no comparison with watching an expert handle a situation that normally gives you trouble while actively commentating about what he's doing and why. Subtle concepts like time and attention management can be explicitly raised and discussed. Something that might have taken you weeks or months to get a handle on previously can now be learned in just a few minutes of watching a good player's stream. Ironically, this is something of a double-edged sword. Previously, players' mechanics and game knowledge tended to advance together. The advent of live streams and professional commentary changes this dramatically, allowing players to know a lot about the game without being able to physically play it very well. This gets back to my earlier point about building the right army composition, but still losing due to a macro deficit. Copying a live stream can create the illusion that the player is doing everything right, compounding their frustration when they lose and creating the false impression of a balance problem. I think this is an issue that will be solved with time as the fundamentals of professional esports become more widely known. Few people think that watching a few NBA games will turn them into a professional basketball player. The net result is that your average dedicated StarCraft II player has a much stronger game understanding than your average Age player 15 years ago. This is interesting to me because while it raises the skill floor to have decent games with regular players, it also makes it much easier to reach that skill floor. On balance, I think it's actually overall beneficial to new players. Attention is what I consider to be the fourth resource of StarCraft II. Due to the fast game speed, players cannot do every single thing optimally. They must pick and choose where they focus their attention. This brings in a lot of interesting scenarios, where players try to pull each other apart by forcing their opponent to invest attention in lots of different places. Efficient use of attention is also its own skill set. Learning how to make units do the right thing without a lot of babysitting frees up attention for other tasks. Even at the highest levels of play, there are always moments where players simply can't pay attention to everything going on at once. We've talked about a lot of things in this series, from a high-level design philosophy to nuts and bolts game mechanics. Beyond a comparison of these two series, I think we can also draw some general conclusions about the real-time strategy genre. StarCraft II was released 5 years after Age of Empires III, during the tail end of a period in the industry when games were continually being simplified and made easier in order to attract a larger audience. Yet Blizzard bucked this trend by releasing a game that was mechanically far more challenging than similar RTS games released in the previous decade. It's worth noting that this wasn't a far-gone conclusion. At the time, the company was experiencing unprecedented mainstream success with World of Warcraft. Franchise titles weren't exempt either, considering the simplifications introduced in Diablo 3. I think one of the reasons Blizzard did what they did with StarCraft II is the distinct lack of success of the simplification approach in the RTS genre. I think the Age of Empires series is one of the best examples. Over time, gimmick after gimmick was added and the mechanics were progressively simplified. Yet the underlying appeal of the games actually went down. Consider Age of Empires 2. Despite being one of the most mechanically difficult entries in the series, it was supported by the modding community for years, eventually resulting in an HD remake. Age of Empires 3 sold 2 million copies after 3 years on the market. StarCraft II sold 3 million copies in its first month. I don't blame Ensemble for this. It's intuitive to think that simplifying a game for a mainstream audience will deliver better sales and allow more customers to enjoy your product. Over time, however, this approach has been shown to be unsuccessful. Players intimidated by a high skill ceiling or mechanical difficulty would probably prefer to play a different type of game anyway. Yet the same simplifications made in order to attract these players end up alienating your core audience that like RTS games just for what they are. My point is that it's easy to look back in hindsight by, for instance, seeing the backpedaling on oversimplification by Bethesda when they developed Fallout 3 and Skyrim, and blame companies for trying to cater to the lowest common denominator as the gaming market rapidly expanded. It's just not that simple. Many top players in the Age community were dismayed by the leveling mechanic in Age of Empires 3, but we justified it to ourselves by thinking it would attract more players. In other words, Ensemble wasn't alone in this line of thinking. We never would have thought a game vastly more difficult and complex like StarCraft II could regularly have tens of thousands of concurrent players, or see hundreds of thousands of active ladder players per season 6 years after its release, despite its explicit emphasis on balancing for the best and focusing on esports. Dustin Browder, in a 2013 Ask Me Anything, said it best when asked about the potential to lose customers to MOBA-style competitors. "We have not seen a decline as a result of the rise of Dota games. We don't see any threat. They are very different games with very different types of players who want to play them." In other words, Blizzard focuses on what works specifically about the real-time strategy genre and tries to make the best RTS game possible. I don't think they've necessarily done a perfect job. No developer ever can. But I think this is the correct overall design philosophy. It stands out as especially successful, both commercially and otherwise, when compared with other RTS games that adopted a different approach, especially the Age series. That said, I think there are a couple lessons we can draw from Age of Empires that would help Blizzard further the longevity of the game. As mentioned, Age of Empires 2 was sustained for a long time by its modding community, partly thanks to the ease of making custom modifications to the game. StarCraft 2 made some good decisions in this area. For instance, Blizzard provides an open source replay parser that allows anyone to crack open and examine replays. By itself, this is a huge deal. It's impossible to watch a replay from a different patch version in the Age series, making virtually all classic Age of Empires 2 replays obsolete. There are, however, still limitations. StarCraft replays can only be rendered in-engine, and that code is proprietary and owned by Blizzard. That's not even the biggest problem. StarCraft II lacks a dedicated LAN mode as well, tying its competitive scene to Blizzard's support for BattleNet. David Kim, in a 2012 interview, noted that LAN simply wasn't part of the game's design philosophy. Unfortunately, this hurts third-party organizations like tournament organizers and PC cafes, important players in the game's wider ecosystem that sustain its popularity and drive long-term sales. These problems could be fixed by simply open sourcing the game, enabling the same kinds of innovations, and many more, that we saw in Age of Empires 2. There will come a point in the game's lifecycle where the benefits of an open source community will outweigh the cost of lost sales and giving away the intellectual property, and I'm guessing the game will reach that point within the next couple of years. In a 2010 interview, Alan DeBeery, one of the lead software engineers on StarCraft II, commented that the title's most underrated feature was its custom games in arcade. These are built not by Blizzard, but by a dedicated community of volunteer map makers. I think we would see a similar level of enthusiasm if the game were open sourced. This would allow for innovations like out-of-engine replay rendering, a dedicated LAN mode, and private balance and design patches built by esports organizations like Kespa. There's an argument that Blizzard doesn't stand to benefit from open sourcing their own intellectual property, but personally I view this as the same intuitive but wrong thinking that led the Age series to progressively water itself down to its own detriment. For one thing, just because private builds are available doesn't mean that most consumers won't obtain, if not outright purchase, the official version offered by the developers, if only to leverage the official Battle.net service. In addition, Blizzard would still retain expertise on the game's design, and likely partner with professional organizations like Kespa in the production of balance patches and competitive maps. Bug fixes and minor feature requests could get handled by volunteers, freeing up Blizzard resources. Security issues also tend to become more shallow and easier to spot when projects become open source. I definitely understand that my perspective here is a bit out there, and the middle-of-the-road approach Blizzard has taken with the numerous APIs that they offer is certainly an excellent alternative. I don't think open source would work for every game, but for a competitive esport, I think it will eventually be essential. Another area where Age and StarCraft are both deficient is their lack of incremental rewards. The real-time strategy genre has always had this problem, and StarCraft II is no exception. Most games provide players with rewards even when they lose. Getting a nice kill in Overwatch is all that's needed for a player to enjoy the game, even if their overall performance is poor. The coarse-grained win-lose mechanic of RTS games makes them difficult to play casually. It emphasizes winning over everything else, which is uncomfortable for players who aren't fully invested. Age of Empires 3 partially solved this problem with its leveling mechanic, but in the end this proved to be too much of a grind. Frankly, I think this topic is so large that it deserves its own video, so I won't go too deeply into it here. I think it's one of the most serious problems facing the genre, and it lacks any easy solutions. In the end, the Age series and StarCraft II turn out to be profoundly different. They have a different target audience. They have a different view of what that audience wants in a game. They rely on similar looking, but functionally completely different nuts and bolts. It's almost hard to believe they belong in the same genre. For its time, the Age series was incredibly innovative. I loved those games, and I miss them dearly. I feel incredibly grateful that a game as good as StarCraft II continues to carry on the RTS torch. That's everything I wanted to talk about today. I hope that you've gained a new perspective on one of these series, or at least have some additional food for thought. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.